Ruriko Morishita worried less about the wrecks she was helping or the hundreds who expired during the evacuation than about the 2,000-odd gravely wounded patients left at Heibaru. A military medic had assured her trucks would soon be sent for them. "Don't worry, we'll get them to you when we find safe caves for them." Believing that as firmly as what she was told about the war in general, enfeebled Ruriko nevertheless continued to worry. Actually, Ward 3 had received a supply of potassium cyanide to solve the problem more simply and honourably. But the Okinawan paediatrician serving as its chief doctor ignored his oral order to administer it. As for Ruriko, only when rumours of poison being handed out and administered to patients in Wards 1 and 2 would reach her new cave would she guess that hundreds had killed themselves or been killed. By that time, however, her more immediate difficulties would make Heibaru's seem less devastating. Ward 3's new cave lay half a mile below the crossroads village of Makabe, about a mile and a half north of the southern tip and 3 miles east of Mabuni and Hill 89, site of the cave of the 32nd Army's last headquarters. Centuries of rainwater had carved a vertical hole in the ground, then a relatively large chamber at the bottom with wings like the tentacles of an octopus. The Cave of the Virgins, as it would become known, was among the area's best. 24 medics, 36 military nurses, and 30 student aides, the Virgins, including Ruriko, arrived there after completing the horrific evacuation that had taken many more lives. If no medical supplies remained, the new ward had no accommodations for the wounded either, nor for that matter for the 90 members of the staff, inasmuch as that cave, like all neighbouring ones, was jammed with local civilians, whom Ward 3's senior medics now ordered to leave. "Military units have priority. We need this place for ourselves." The head military nurse, who had joined the 32nd Army after her public health offices were destroyed by the 10/10th's air raid, would have years of nightmares about her role in helping murder fellow Okinawans, who obediently crawled out to their imminent slaughter. With no wounded to care for, the medical staff turned to thoughts of their own unlikely survival. Perhaps because there were no duties to attend to, exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed them, striking down even Miss Victory Day, who with her fellow aides slept in a wing separate from the military nurses. Most ran high fevers, all were painfully weak. Although the underground dankness nurtured incipient tuberculosis, they ventured outside the cave only when ordered by the Japanese medics, chiefly to fetch water. Ruriko began wondering whether all its inhabitants shouldn't share that risk. Weren't they all Japanese, after all? But her unspoken disappointment in her immediate superiors led to no questions about the war's rights and wrongs, even when caustic Japanese medics lectured the aides about their own importance. "We're here protecting you Okinawans, so of course it should be your job to bring our water." At night, the aides were also ordered out to hunt for sugarcane, weeds, anything to assuage the constant hunger, and to sneak to other caves, search for unexpelled civilians there, and requisition their food. The 32nd Army disbanded all civilian corps on June 18th, about 3 weeks after Ruriko's arrival in the new cave. 96 people were in the Cave of the Virgins when messengers delivered the order, henceforth act on your own, the following evening. Each aide was given about a pint of brown rice and 2 bags of hardtack. One enlivened their farewell party by chanting Nani Wabushi, highly popular stories performed in a sing-song voice. A teacher displayed his dancing skills, and there were many choruses of school carols and songs of goodbye before the gathering ended in the old pledge. "Whether I float as a corpse under the waters or sink beneath the grasses of the mountainside, I will willingly die for the Emperor." While soldiers cleaned a machine gun in preparation for fighting their way out, the aides too made ready to exit and disband, some, like Ruriko, convinced that Japan would soon rise again. At dusk the next day they heard American voices. The clearest, which sounded female, called "Detekoi, Detekoi," again and again. The silence in the cave was laden with tension, but not fear. All had seen too many corpses to be terrified by death. Ruriko was only slightly surprised to feel so little emotion. and to hear a voice outside speaking Japanese. "Are there any civilians in this cave? If so, cease your useless resistance and come out. Otherwise, we'll throw bombs in there." The minutes seemed like days. Ruriko tried to coax two friends to retreat to the cave's even more uncomfortable innards. Suddenly, a Japanese nurse moved toward the exit, having decided at the last moment that she must find her father, an army doctor serving elsewhere on the island. A student aide also wanted to leave. Ward 3's former Okinawan pediatrician had earlier darted to a cave that housed the hospital administration, leaving in charge a Japanese army doctor and senior medic, who now ordered the errant women to stay put. Posting an armed guard at the entrance, they repeated that no American promises of safety could be trusted. A shattering explosion interrupted their angry words. Thick white smoke, impenetrable, suffocating, filled that part of the cave. Terrified voices cried, "Gas! Poison gas!" Scores died in minutes. Others screamed desperately for water. "Mother! Father! Help me, please!" Ruriko couldn't breathe. A wounded orderly told her to urinate on her trousers and hold them to her mouth, but that protection against the poison gas, of course, provided no oxygen. Almost all the dead, including the aide who wanted to find her father, were apparently killed by suffocation rather than the explosion itself, which was probably of white phosphorus hand grenades. The cave resounded with even more desperate screams of, "Mother! Father!" Ruriko's best friend lay beside her, moaning about herself and her poor parents, who, she now realized, had probably died in the same unbearable pain. "Sisters, I'm going now, before you do." Gasp. "Oh, how it hurts." Gasp. "Long live the Emperor!" Those words somehow told Ruriko not to expire in that terrible place, but although she resolved to leave so she could breathe real air, she found she couldn't move. A giant force strangled her until she lost consciousness, terrified yet happy that the agony was over. When she came to, probably saved by her urine-soaked trousers, she discovered she could produce no sound whatever from her mouth. A fellow aide named Yoshiko also regained consciousness to find her hand tightly held by a third friend. Moving it up and down, Yoshiko called the third girl's name but got no answer. It took her some moments of hard staring into the darkness to see the hand she was clasping belonged to a headless corpse. Yoshiko struggled to her feet and looked down at the nearest bodies, where something moved. "Someone's alive!" she tried to shout, but she too now lost her voice. Soon she recognized the living person as Ruriko, who felt no sadness, no emotion, only numbness. During the following 2 days, more friends joined the heaps of dead ones, agony twisting their faces. On the 3rd, 4 of the 30 nurses' aides remained alive. The stench of rotting flesh drove them out that evening. Led by a teacher who'd also cheated death, they dragged themselves outside the cave, where American fire quickly killed the teacher and 2 girls as they tried to crawl away. Escaping the bullets, Ruriko took shelter in another cave, which she left 4 evenings later with another handful of survivors. None knew that the Americans had declared the battle over, the island secure. In fact, they saw no Americans at all. Apart from flares that lit up the night, their island seemed empty. Still dazed from the explosion in the Cave of the Virgins, Ruriko crawled about, not very far in her condition. In the flat area that lacked outcroppings of coral and crops, the fields were totally scorched, for cover. Separation from others alternated with merging with still others for protection and sanity. Occasionally, the prey fell asleep in mid-step. Shot 3 times, Ruriko would later, after treatment by 10th Army medics and a realization that she'd been a dupe of Japanese militarism, assume the shooters had aimed at her legs because they'd won the battle and weren't hunting for more lives. It couldn't have been because they took pity on a female. The gender of the filthy refugee in her ragged military uniform was impossible to discern. When she woke up the last time, American soldiers were standing over her little cluster of fugitives. A girl who pulled the pin of a hand grenade to save herself from them was near enough so that Ruriko, very weak from her wounds and malnutrition, knew she'd surely die at last. She waited with closed eyes. The grenade was a dud, leaving her also among the lucky. 123 of the 155 Himayuri girls would soon be dead, together with scores of aides from the 5 less prestigious high schools. And some 3,700 soldiers and 3,800 civilians died in and around the village of Haberu, meadows of the southerly wind. 24. Mopping up. Okinawa's third mountain spine traversed its width some 3 miles from the south end, 2 miles from General Ushijima's new headquarters on the cliff facing the Pacific. The 32nd Army's last strongpoints were manned by fresh units or survivors of battles farther north, who'd had 4 or 5 days for frantic preparations before the Americans arrived. The ragged heights presented another forbidding barrier to attackers, especially 2 mountains in the center called Yoza-dake and Yaeju-dake. Between those towering island formations, massive escarpments with hills and ridges made the terrain almost as formidable as at the Shuri line. Although lack of water kept defenders from establishing positions on the peaks, sister regiments of Kojo's 22nd used protective formations lower down, still with excellent lines of sight on the approaches. As at Shuri, efficient defense systems with interlocking fire awaited the Americans. The last of the Japanese anti-tank guns and heavy artillery zeroed in on the open ground, and passes where the attackers, including large numbers of green replacements, were most vulnerable. Although the defenders were far too few and too depleted to stop the tank-supported advances, they had more than enough arms to rip apart unlucky units assigned to take the hardest objectives. Also, as before, the army divisions faced some of the most difficult mazes of hills, in this case on the Pacific half of the butte-like barrier protecting Ushijima's new headquarters. Many were so steep that they had to be scaled by cargo nets under cover of darkness. In the sectors where Japanese newly arrived from the Shuri line were too disorganized and discouraged to fight with a fraction of their previous tenacity, the unfortunates were mowed down and burned out with relative ease. But defenders elsewhere used combinations of cliffs, steep slopes, and hundreds of crags, crevices, and niches in the coral and rock to resist for days. Faces stiff with exhaustion, heads bound in bands emblazoned with "Got to win," many Japanese still fought superbly. One company of the American Army's 96th Division lost 75 of 175 men in a single day on Yoza-dake. A Marine company lost 70 men and all its officers taking one hill. The survivors of a group that tried to crawl away from an ambush of intense Japanese fire succeeded on the 8th night of consecutive attempts. The loss of old comrades dismayed Americans even more than before. To be hit so late in the game, having survived so much, seemed the cruelest fate. Yet the day-by-day chance of being killed or wounded actually increased. Having dropped significantly after the taking of the Shuri, American casualties grew again at the last barrier, where a properly supplied and reinforced 32nd Army would have built another Shuri line. The hardest fighting took place at Kunishi Ridge, half a mile to the west of Yoza-dake and 1 mile in from the East China Sea. The 2,000-yard-long outcropping was smooth and steep enough to have been constructed to the defenders' specifications. On June 9th, units of the 1st Marine Division forded a little stream that marked the start of the assault on the ridge. As at Sugar Loaf, they then had to cross an open area to reach the objective, which was serviced by a single road covered by defenders, also from a sister regiment of Kojo's 22nd, who were dug in at all the best places with more surviving armament than any other unit, together with a detailed fire plan for the exposed areas that had to be crossed. After making no progress the next 2 days, the Marines had to bring up reinforcements in tanks. 21 were destroyed during assaults and counter-assaults similar to those at the Shuri line. Progress up the hillsides was yard by yard against intense fire from concealed guns and mortars. It took 3 more long, hard days, 5 in all. So it went at the other strongpoints in the last line, on and off the twin peaks of Yoza-dake and Yaeju-dake. The approach to the latter was blocked by a large mass called the Big Apple, from which the artillery fire was deadly. The fierce battles for hills 69 and 95, the western and eastern anchors of that last mountain barrier, were sagas in themselves. Ushijima had ordered the positions defended to the death. For marine units, the action in the far south was spotty. The unlucky ones continued taking heavy fire from steep coral formations as they crawled ahead or inched around to rake the hidden enemy with their own armament. Others drove toward the southern coast almost unopposed. But nighttime's nightmare became worse because more dislodged Japanese prowled from dusk to dawn, many hunting for food and water rather than for the enemy. But Americans didn't know that. When an infantryman named Charles Leonard threw his last grenade into a shallow cave, a great cloud of smoke gushed out, together with some burning white phosphorus. A gob landed on his sleeve, melted through it in an instant, and emitted a nauseating smell as it burned into his flesh. Yanking the bayonet from his rifle, he scraped furiously at the phosphorus, while out from the cave from which he'd turned his attention, charged a Japanese soldier with his bayonet. Leonard managed to kill him with 4 quick rounds and only superficial wounds to himself from the enemy blade. The dead body slumped to the ground. Leonard shot it 4 more times and continued jerking on the trigger even after his clip had ejected. Manifestations of camaraderie and of bad luck also continued. A platoon leader wounded on Sugarloaf badgered hospital personnel to discharge him. He needn't have gone back to the line, maybe even shouldn't have in his condition, but his men were still there. The night after he resumed command of them, a hand grenade and coral fragments smashed his face to pulp. On the morning of June 19th, a 14-year-old Okinawan named Shinichi Kuniyoshi was in a hillside cave above the levelled hamlet of Asato, a mile north of the last mountain barrier, near the site of the decoy American landing on L-Day. Shinichi had been so hungry so long that his skinny body looked like a child's, while his dirty face, aged by the fighting, might have belonged to a 30-year-old. Before the battle, the boy stood out because his father, who had come to identify with Japanese ambitions and discipline while working on the mainland, imbued him with his own pride in having served in the Imperial Japanese Army at a time when it was still rejecting 4 of 5 Okinawan draftees. On top of that, the Army's exploits during the war's early years enthralled Shinichi and his inseparable friend Miyagi, who dreamed of becoming officers. Shinichi's father was called up again, this time as one of the Home Guard's 20,000. His oldest brother, a soldier in Manchuria, would be captured by the Soviet Army when it entered the war a week before its end, and kept for 5 years of Siberian slave labor. A second and third brother, one a sailor in the Imperial Navy and the other a kamikaze pilot, would soon be killed in action. His mother wept and pleaded to Shinichi, her only son still at home, but she lost to the exciting game of war. A month before L-Day, he and fellow 9th grader Miyagi volunteered to serve with the 32nd Army, vowing to die for Japan. Their perilous work delivering messages in a less prestigious unit than Masahide Ota's could not dim their patriotism or devotion to the Imperial Army. Only one incident was troubling. In May, Shinichi found himself with a unit kept without water for several days by extraordinarily intense American shelling. Although Shinichi instantly obeyed a soldier's order to dash to a nearby well, he felt the soldier himself should have taken that great risk. However, his own unit was like a family, its gentle sergeant named Inagaki serving as a surrogate father to the 46 boys. On nights when Inagaki considered the shelling too terrible, he risked his own life in failing to follow a superior's orders by not dispatching them with their messages. Still, only 6 survived their racing or creeping from cave to cave, or charges at American troops and tanks. Now Shinichi and Miyagi crouched in the relatively solid Asato cave with a group of lost soldiers they barely knew, while the Americans assigned to that sector of the last mountain line were about to approach. There was something admirable as well as terrible in the methodical advance of their tanks and soldiers, which were clearing the entire hill. They did their grim work cave by cave, job by deadly job. Survivors of some nearby caves that had already been blown had taken refuge in this one, doubling its inhabitants to 50 or 60 soldiers. They had small arms, grenades, and a light machine gun for use against the enemy's flame-throwing tanks, everyone's greatest worry, whose roaring exhaust announced the time had come at about 6:30 a.m. But they missed the cave's well-concealed, almost hidden vertical mouth and continued up the hill. Squeezing in with soldiers directly under the entrance shaft, Shin-ichi tried to keep his body covered while awkwardly firing up at the legs of American infantrymen who were following the tanks. The return fire down into the cave was as effective as their own was futile because of the angle. Corpses piled up under the entrance. Brave men crawled from the cave's farther reaches to replace them. At 7 o'clock they heard, "Okay!" in an urgent American voice. A minute later, a blinding explosion knocked them flat. When Shinichi came to, his eardrums felt shattered, and his arms were pinned in excruciating positions by a terrible weight pressing on his chest. Face down and unable to move, he guessed 6 or so corpses were in the pile, crushing and suffocating him. Miyagi's moaning pleas echoed from the walls along with others, but he could do nothing to help his friend, whose voice lasted longest. When it went silent, Shin-ichi himself began to moan, perhaps hoping a human sound might dispel his infinite despair. Neither arm could be freed for using his hand grenade on himself, but he supposed the weight of the bodies would kill him soon. Hours later, a voice from deep in the cave asked who was calling for help. Soon the relief that the voice bestowed from utter gloom was reinforced by the miraculous sounds of steps inching unsteadily toward him. At last, the terrible weight on his body was very slowly lightened. Finally free to roll over, he saw the unit's gangling young commander above him, both eyeballs hanging low on his cheeks, and the metal fragment that had forced them out wedged in his forehead. Dripping blood and exhausted from his effort, the lieutenant dropped to the ground. "You can still fight, so take my pistol," he wheezed. "It's got 3 rounds. Use 2 against the enemy and the last one for yourself. But first, try to get to headquarters and report what happened to us here." When the lieutenant died, it was Shin-ichi's turn to feel his way in the dark. The corpses had apparently saved him from more than cuts and bruises. He found Miyagi's body and tried to stifle his weeping. "I'll get back at them for this. I promise on my life. I'll kill as many as I can." Then he climbed over the piles of decomposing flesh at the cave's mouth. Although the front line had pushed well south of it, the sight of enemy soldiers nearby, stacking ammunition, prompted him to return to the dark and wait with the bodies. Sneaking out again after dusk, he encountered more Americans almost immediately, some in foxholes, others pitching tents to radio music. But the sentries patrolling every 15 yards or so failed to see him. The headquarters cave the lieutenant had sighted in his last order was on Yozadake, about 1.5 miles due east. With the enemy shells pounding it as his guide, Shin-ichi believed he could find his way even at night. First, he had to pick the safest spot to slip through the enemy line, then the safest trail. On his belly, dragging himself by his elbows, he made about 1 yard a minute. The first streaks of dawn found him exhausted, and in the middle of an American encampment. The only consolation was that it was, of course, free of enemy shelling, bombing, and strafing. But he knew he was finished unless he found cover immediately. Raising his head just enough to look around, he saw clusters of Japanese corpses in a drainage ditch. Inching there, he covered himself with bodies, completing his camouflage before full light. All he had to do was look like another corpse until sunset, in about 16 hours. Larger problems kept him from dwelling on the appalling stench of the real corpses roasting in the sun. The hardest was to fool the beasts by not moving a single muscle. Daylight temperatures, of course, rose higher than Okinawa's late June mean of over 85 degrees, especially here in the far south. The abnormally hot sun of that late June on that particular plateau, long known for its lack of water, scorched him unmercifully. Involuntary pleas for his mother sounded in the adolescent's head. He hadn't eaten or drunk for days. The agony of his thirst exceeded that of maggots wriggling from the corpses into his fresh cuts, nostrils, mouth, and anus. But he didn't move for the full 16 hours, and triumphed. When it was dark enough to resume, the stunning bombardment of Yozadeke kept him headed in the right direction through all detours around enemy positions, animal instinct alerting him to their breathing and body heat. Only the unrelieved thirst became unbearable, but he continued crawling until something suddenly landed on his back, frightening him almost literally out of his mind. "You carry me to Yoza! On your back!" One leg of the Japanese soldier who hissed those frantic words was a mushy stump of raw flesh and crushed bone. The lad of under 5 feet and less than 100 pounds had no choice but to obey, even knowing he'd now never make Yoza. It was a sentence to death from an enemy rifle because he'd have to stand or slouch to try to manage his burden. However, the order had come from a superior, who pointed a pistol at his head for good measure. The dead weight buckled his knees. After 20 yards in a field littered with Japanese corpses, the famished boy could not take another step. "Sir," he whispered, "I have to go. I have a bad case of the runs." His pistol unmoving, the soldier ordered him to take care of your business right here. Setting down the millstone and making as if to open his own trousers, Shinichi tried to calculate how much the missing leg would slow his tormentor's movements and whether he'd be willing to bring on his own certain death by firing. He held his breath, raced away, and dived to the ground, saved once more. Finding his way again, he headed for the flares lighting Yozadake like 100 moons. Aware that his thirst was more likely to finish him than exhaustion, he nevertheless reached the mountain before dawn, and his luck held long enough so that no shell hit him on his crawl to the headquarters cave. Some 30 soldiers inside, hardly believing the boy had managed the odyssey from enemy-held Asato, praised him generously. As if that weren't enough, they treated him to as much as he wanted of all they possessed. Dizzy with pride and happiness, he drank his belly full of water, feasted from their bags of hardtack, and could ask for nothing more. American atrocities. In mid-June, a week before the campaign's official end, Japanese began surrendering in sizable numbers. Until then, the average had been 4 men daily, most physically or mentally disabled by explosives. Many American companies fought for 8 or 10 weeks without taking a single prisoner. But when the 32nd Army's teetering morale began going over the edge in some units lacking all communications with others, white flags or substitutes became a relatively common sight. On June 12th, the day after Admiral Ota's farewell message to General Ushijima, a stunning 159 members of his naval base force surrendered from among those who hadn't killed themselves before the Marine spectators on the Oroku Peninsula. The daily average rose from mid-June's 4 to 50 during the 3rd week of the month, soaring to 343 on June 19th alone, a huge number by Japanese standards. One 4-man patrol captured 150 prisoners after their officers bowed, shot some Okinawan women who'd been accompanying them, and killed themselves. In all, almost 3,000 Japanese were taken prisoner during the second half of June, about a third of the number killed during the same period. The final count would come to 7,400, somewhat less astounding than it seemed because about half were conscripted Okinawans. Still, it was more than during all the rest of the Pacific War, and many Americans, having seen no enemy soldiers at all apart from dead ones, were justifiably frightened by sudden appearances of droves of living ones. A Marine fire team approaching the cliffs above the southern coast in late June was startled by 4 enemy soldiers who emerged from the bush carrying 2 wounded ones on stretchers. They gestured for the 4 to drop their gear and strip. When they were in loincloths and little able to work a trick, the Americans approached with sea rations, water and smokes. Suddenly, up to 100 more poured from nowhere and surrounded the Marines, who included 18-year-old Lenley Cotton. Having seen Japanese blow themselves up with grenades held to their chests, Cotton thought that the well-armed crowd would see to his end. There we were, completely surrounded. They could have finished us like Custer. They didn't seem to know what they were going to do, and we sure as hell didn't know, only that dying was their honourable thing and taking an American along was even better. But they'd probably sent out those first 6 to test us, see whether we'd torture them. After an age, they gave themselves up, the whole bunch. Such surrenders were new in Japanese history. Although the percentage remained very slight relative to those killed in action, the absolute count leapt to nearly 1,000, probably half of them conscripted Okinawans, on June 20th and 21. That was the number of prisoners taken. The number shot will never be known. Some Americans believe it was many. You had no mercy for them whatever by the end of the campaign, one would explain. 9 Marines in 10 would shoot them. If you saw a Japanese trying to surrender, you'd let him have it fast. Other participants have disputed that. Another infantryman remembered his outfit as pretty damn tough. It was all hate and kill. But when we took a prisoner, he stayed alive. The truth between the extreme claims can't be measured except to say that the killing of prisoners was widespread in at least some of the units. Many officers condoned and even suggested it, until the multiple surrenders near the very last days. Your company commander would say, "Take these people, Japanese prisoners, to regimental headquarters and be back here in 5 minutes," a third infantryman would explain. Regimental headquarters was 30 minutes away. He was telling you to get rid of them. We gave our prisoners every excuse to run so we could finish them, another veteran would add. Nobody wanted to escort them 500 yards through scary terrain where he could be shot. Nobody wanted to go 5 yards with them. For what? A weary platoon of Owen Stebbins's G222 company was cleaning out a sugarcane field south of Naha in early June. One of its combat veterans was calculating whether to jump across a little brook or get his feet wet when a young replacement's terror-frozen face instantly sent him into a higher level of alert. The veteran, Irving Oertel, shot at almost the same instant as he looked down and saw a Japanese arm reaching through some reeds to grip the replacement by an ankle. No one will ever know whether the wretched man was trying to hurt the American or surrender or both. Later, I realized that's what the Japanese might have been trying to do, surrender. But what I did then was what anyone with experience would have done, shot him that second. Killing was instinct by that time. You were shot if you didn't shoot. You killed and didn't think twice about it. When they started surrendering, another man would remember, we were supposed to take them back to the command post or to some guys who came up from regimental headquarters. But we never took a lot of them back. We shot them. Me too. We did it because what we'd all been through all that time, understand? It was that terrible combat. It was Japanese pretending to surrender so they could shoot you. One dressed in civilian clothes suddenly whips a pistol from behind his back and tries to get us with it. I saw plenty of things like that, but one was enough for everybody. So not many prisoners arrived back at command posts until the very last days. A member of an army transportation company encountered a group of Marines who counseled him to shoot the prisoner he was escorting to the rear. The soldier took the suggestion, but his carbine jammed, whereupon the Marines advised him to take his time and clean it, which he did, then fired. The same soldier, perhaps remembering how casually he'd been urged, assumed a truckload he saw of Naval Base Force prisoners was being driven to a convenient place for shooting. They seemed white with fear. Shooting a man who had his hands up, or may have wanted to put them up, wasn't necessarily an atrocity. No American infantryman, whatever his previous moral tenets, had any question that unless every Japanese who prompted the slightest doubt about his intentions was killed, he would kill Americans. That cliché expressed an unrelenting reality on Okinawa. It did not necessarily reflect racial hatred or any other kind. Many simply knew the job had to be done. On top of that, however, most riflemen were exhausted, frightened, and full of grief for their own losses when they pulled their triggers on the unarmed or seemingly unarmed men. Some felt ambivalent about the enemy. Some had twinges of respect, admiration, perhaps sympathy. William Manchester was among those who hated other people more, including Frank Sinatra and everyone else who was free of danger and actually enjoying himself, whereas the Japanese were right where we were, in the mud and shit, getting pounded by artillery. But most of the time, the feelings of virtually all Americans in the line were clear. The bond with their comrades in arms prompted loathing for those who shot and shelled them. I didn't hate the Japanese before, one would remember. It came the minute I saw my first buddy lying there in parts, the guy I lived with every day, the guy I loved. I started hating the men, and I feel it to this day. I saw my buddy get killed. It made no difference that killing was a primary and intrinsic goal of both sides, and that there was nothing personal in it. Despite that logic of war, the death of friends was a shattering personal tragedy for all Americans, as of course for all Japanese. Flamethrower Evan Regal knew most of his company's 69 KIAs, of its original 256 men. The Japanese had to be killed anyway because of how they fought. There was no other way. But what made you want to do it was your friends. When you saw their corpses day after day, your hatred, oh God, hatred, built day after day. By June, I had no mercy for a single Japanese who wanted to surrender. Any inclination to be merciful was further reduced by the aspiration to emerge whole, hidden hope that rose in proportion to the approach of victory. When the ocean below the southern coast became visible from the high ground, Americans had a real chance to make it, and many resolved to do so, to beat the casualty odds no matter what. That was just when the number of Japanese prisoners surged, along with the pressure for their quick disposal. To escort a prisoner to the rear was to expose oneself to very real extra danger. No one wanted to gamble on leaving the security of his unit for a single step through land dotted with hidden caves and spider holes. Such risk was taken to help a buddy back to an aid station, but not for Japanese whose fellow Japanese had killed so many of yours and who was aiming to add you to his count. Not for a sneaky rat who, even at this stage and even after being searched, might die happily by pulling a grenade from an orifice and blowing you up along with himself. Every combat American had seen or heard of killing performances of the final duty. Their goal was to dispose quickly of everyone who might try. Ordinarily mild, Norris Bukta had learned, they were simply capable of too many devious ways and tricks. You didn't want to get within grenade-throwing range of them, so you sometimes shot them as fast as you could. There were also sound practical reasons for torching Okinawan huts, as Americans continued to call native houses. Since enemy snipers hid in some, no regret or guilt was felt burning large numbers to the ground. And there were provocations for many unreported incidents of cruelty. In early April, a Marine fire team used cigarettes to burn USMC on the chest of a dazed Japanese soldier they'd captured, then broke his leg by dropping the stretcher on which they were carrying him to the rear. Beyond that, there was the Japanese way of fighting. People who charged through their own artillery fire on their way to American positions showed they cared less for themselves than for their emperor, and were willing to spill any amount of blood for their own satisfactions, as well as for him. In the third week of June, a Korean laborer emerged from a cave near the southern tip and told the American team that had blasted it a dead Marine was inside. Reluctant to enter in case some of the Japanese were still alive, the Americans gave the Korean a wire to tie to the corpse. When they pulled it out, one of the team saw an old pre-war friend who'd also trained with him on Guadalcanal. His ears and penis had been cut off, his face smeared with excrement. Maybe an angel wouldn't have wanted to take revenge against such barbarity. The Marines suspected of driving the truckload of Naval Base Force Japanese to possible shooting had just taken some territory where American captives had evidently been shot. "Okay," one of them said, "the Japanese don't take prisoners and we won't either." Some Americans sprayed cave mouths with full submachine gun magazines after promising safety to all who came out with their hands up, but even they weren't necessarily war criminals, although not all other Americans considered them fully normal either. But if some of the brutal acts could be rationalized, others couldn't. War spawned many unqualified atrocities on Okinawa, as it almost always does. Once you kill somebody, the first one, it's much easier after that, Ed Jones would remember. When they came out of the caves, it was like target practice, like a turkey shoot. Some of the most revolting acts involved the enemy dead. One machine gun squad moved about with a makeshift little pipe for directing their urine into the mouths of Japanese corpses. I like to think we went to Okinawa with American standards and morals. a man in that squad would remember in shame and disgust. But it was a crazy world there, and we did crazy things. On one of the last days of the official campaign, a platoon leader asked for volunteers to clean up a cave that had been vainly showered with surrender leaflets. Noises disclosed that enemy soldiers were still inside, but Lenley Cotton, one of the crazies, in his own description, was looking for a little more excitement now that the real fighting had dulled down. He and other volunteers lowered themselves into a theatre-like cavern that fronted the cave. While taking prisoners there, Cotton saw a Japanese fail to raise his hands. He fired a burst of his bar at his feet and saw the man dash deeper into the cave. Just after Cotton called for a satchel charge, he heard the pin of a Japanese grenade being driven in and turned to race away, but couldn't move fast enough over the coral. Exploding precisely where he had been standing, the grenade sent fragments of steel and coral into most of his body. He would spend 11 months recovering in hospitals. When the satchel charge was thrown and the dazed Japanese emerged from hiding, probably with ruptured eardrums, another volunteer fell on him with his K-bar knife. He was a buddy, Cotton would remember. He'd lost one friend after another since April, and he himself had had a dozen minor wounds. I felt pretty happy when I heard the Japanese had been slashed to death. Nice going they got, that son of a bitch. Later, Cotton's happiness would be replaced by memory of the poor guy and regret for war's madness and cruelty. He was one of the vast majority on Okinawa who killed frequently without becoming killers, whose killing was sane, not sadistic. But almost inevitably, a small percentage of Americans was as thrilled by the act of killing as by winning the battle. Almost inevitably, too, the percentage of disturbed psyches grew during the campaign. Every combat infantryman knew men, sometimes heroes, who took unnatural pleasure in the pain it was his duty to cause. There was also the strange lust for souvenirs. If the Japanese determination to die defied explanation to most Americans, their own passion for largely worthless Japanese artifacts also bordered on the bizarre. In a campaign that demanded every ounce of energy to stay alive, every infantryman knew one of the most perilous things he could do was go on a souvenir hunt. A disproportionate number who left their units for that sport, usually in 2s and 3s, often without informing their platoon leaders, were later found with their torsos riddled or throats slit. Some were killed by souvenirs that had themselves been booby-trapped, grenades fixed behind pictures on hut walls, Japanese rifles wired to explode when picked up. Yet no amount of risk deterred multitudes from violating fundamental rules of the combat wisdom they'd acquired with such pain. Veterans of previous campaigns launched the competition for trophies as early as L-Day. When the unknowing Zero landed at Yomitan airfield that afternoon, Marines rushed to strip the pilot the moment they shot him, and the game of collecting, often, as one observer put it, before the enemy hit the ground, was on. Samurai swords led the list. Other prized items included Japanese battle flags and waistbands made by loving mothers who solicited contributions of a stitch each from 1,000 women in the soldiers' neighborhood, a favorite of kamikaze pilots on their final flights. But terrible risks were also taken for the most doubtful treasure. Letters, teeth, belts, bones, underwear, yellowed snapshots, dirty caps, watches, rifles, combs, rice bowls, ears and fingers for pickling, anything. Infantrymen who travelled light and lean would proudly proclaim, "Got me a souvenir," then unwrap something from their packs to show around, an ear. It did not have to be military. Booty was also taken from the most humble Okinawan home, often family photographs on the walls. One man grabbed 2 photograph albums, a tracksuit and a pair of shoes, of an Okinawan track star it happened, from the rubble. The albums would lie unopened under his bed for nearly 4 decades before he returned them. Others looted Okinawan offices of documents for which they had no conceivable use. Dedicated collectors removed leg wrappings from reeking corpses. An otherwise admirable married man complained in a letter home that a wedding ring he'd taken turned out to be brass and tarnished my whole finger. An officer observed a soldier searching the body of a Japanese he'd just killed. A wallet was among the items that tumbled out when he slit his pockets with his trench knife. Examining it, the looter found, much to his surprise, that it contained some American identification cards and several snapshots of an American girl. "Why those dirty?" he cursed. "They even rob our dead!" The passion for loot derived partly from life assertion. To the displaced, frightened young collectors, the objects were proof of their survival in the netherworld of combat against the fanatical Japanese. But it also derived from a view of those Japanese as less than fully human. The otherwise worthless souvenirs had the value of being from another species, another planet. It is inconceivable to me that Americans in Europe would value some old sock or filthy cap just because it had belonged to a German, yet that is what is regularly done with Japanese souvenirs, wrote Donald Keene, a naval officer who would become a distinguished scholar of Japanese literature. The curiosity attached to the Japanese prisoner is such that many Americans are amazed to find that some of them are reasonably well built, that others have had enough education to say "thank you" in English, which is usually interpreted as "he speaks fluent English." I think the answer is that the Americans are unable as yet to appreciate the Japanese as human beings. A good proportion of American letters home was devoted to the booty and to resentment when it was confiscated. "You risk your life getting the darn things," a veteran complained, evidently oblivious to the folly he was revealing, "and then some jerk takes them away from you." Some items were confiscated as contraband firearms, others because they were evidence of the officially prohibited mutilation of corpses, as when infantrymen rushed from their foxholes at first light to yank gold teeth from the enemy infiltrators killed during the night. Here, too, letters home revealed an almost innocent greed, as when a machine gunner informed his mother of his rights to a Japanese corpse he'd shot. Souvenirs were also solid currency for obtaining cigarettes, fruit juice, and other valuables, including pornographic photographs. The latter were supplied mostly by Navy photographers who had access to negatives in a rear base. In mid-May, a sailor traded a dozen dirty pictures for a stained little Japanese flag, and what a witness to the transaction took to be a small quantity of opium. As soon as their fighting finished, infantrymen hitchhiked to other units to sell or exchange some of their acquisitions. One who'd relieved a Japanese doctor of his sword, which goes big out here and it's a mighty proud thing to own, hoped to sell enough prizes to buy a little car when he returned home. At that point, he also had 3 rifles, 2 of which he would give away or trade, and one he'd sell for $50, just under a month's salary. A 4th rifle was stolen, although he'd taken the precaution of sleeping with it to guard against that. Trophy hunting merged with sadism when gold teeth were pried not only from corpses, but also from those badly wounded, who were first stabbed, bayoneted, or shot as they lay on the ground. In general, the most zealous collectors of ears and skulls were the most likely to commit atrocities. Ernie Pyle prettified souvenir hunting like the rest of combat. "One of these days, Mrs. Leland Taylor of Jackson Meesh is going to be the envy of all her friends," he filed in April, "for she is about to come into possession of 4 pairs of the most beautiful Japanese pajamas you ever saw. Mrs. Taylor's husband, who is a Marine corporal and known as Pop, found these pajamas in a wicker basket hidden in a cave. Pop carries the basket around on his arm from place to place until he gets a chance to ship them home." As usual, the supply of supposedly charming detail concealed the real story. Several days after the comic incident of a Japanese sneaking up on Dick Whittaker's buddy while he was relieving himself, members of the company, still on the Oroku Peninsula, came upon a little house that promised some comfort for a night after its rice paper door and windows were knocked out to provide clear fields of fire from inside. Toward morning, Whittaker lay half awake on a mat, calculating whether it was safe to light a cigarette. Once again, he'd gotten little of the sleep his body craved, now less because of fear of an intruder cutting his throat than because he'd spent much of the night standing watch. His assignment as a runner for the company commander being still quite recent, he hardly knew Charles Oates, the man now on watch. He did know that young Private Oates himself had been a runner for the previous company commander, Captain Robert Fowler, and that Fowler's death had deeply upset him, with good reason. Difficult Oates was thought to have gone a little Asiatic, meaning sadistic or willing to court too much risk in his eagerness to kill. The irony in that tag for fellow Americans with a penchant for brutality was apparently unintentional. Then Fowler took him under his wing, and Oates, who'd bucked orders from everyone else, settled down under his surrogate father, until the captain bled to death from a wound in the spleen. Now, in the dark of the house, Oates touched Whitaker and turned back to stare at something outside. Without so much as a whisper, Whitaker silently crawled to a knocked-out window, from which he made out 3 Japanese soldiers approaching with extreme caution through a thick morning mist rising from a nearby canal. When they were 100 yards away, Whitaker saw they were in loincloths, apparently unarmed and possibly intending to give themselves up. Shuffling forward in half steps, they soon saw Oates in the doorway, who gestured for them to keep coming. Then Whitaker noticed he was holding behind his back Captain Fowler's gift to the stricken, grieving problem kid as the former lay bleeding to death. It was a chrome-plated Colt .44. Whitaker knew Japanese who stripped almost naked could be signalling a wish to surrender, but also that loincloths could conceal grenades. Either way, he also knew never to trust a pistol alone. Again, without a word, he slithered to his mat, picked up his submachine gun, and covered the 3 unknowns while they continued inching forward to the beckoning from the doorway, until they were 20 yards away, when Oates dropped to a crouch and fired as if in a Western movie. The sprawled bodies meant nothing to Whitaker at the time. He and his buddies had seen so much death in so many ways that 3 more weren't worth thinking about. If he had thought then, he'd have reckoned they were Japanese who deserved to die. What stayed with him was only how Oates saw to it. The rules would have had him stop the Japanese and search them, awakening the others in the unit in the process. If he'd preferred killing them, he could have done that too without objection by the other Americans. But in order to avenge the death of the captain he loved, the killer, as he became known after Fowler's death, a significant term among Marines, who were all killers, had to do it with his prized gun. That was different from the nasty job of killing. Within a week, Oates was missing from his unit. Nothing was heard of the violator of combat wisdom until a flame-throwing tank found his body several days later. Whitaker and the others guessed he'd died on a private, extracurricular mission to kill more Japanese. Atrocities against natives shouldn't be mentioned without stressing the 10th Army's overriding respect for the Geneva Convention, and specifying that most units were frequently told, in some cases constantly admonished, to try to save innocent lives. For most troops, such lectures were superfluous. They didn't want to kill unarmed civilians. In many cases, they risked their lives not to, by throwing smoke instead of phosphorus or fragmentation grenades into caves, for example. That consideration for the possible native families inside allowed any Japanese soldiers mingled with them a chance to shoot back. It also merits repeating that many Americans were humane far beyond the Convention's requirements. Voluntary mercies and kindnesses to civilians abounded, from individual fighters emptying their packs to feed children, to units adopting older children as mascots, to corpsmen, the same ones who saved Japanese wounded, delivering Okinawan babies under extremely difficult conditions, and not only corpsmen. Sergeant J.R. Aichi, a machine gunner never trained in obstetrics, delivered or helped deliver 5 babies during the campaign, all of whom he'd see on post-war trips back to Okinawa. The photographs of GIs and leathernecks passing out candy bars, cigarettes, and cans of food didn't lie, nor was the American public wrong to be convinced of their men's instinctive magnanimity. An Okinawan kid hiding in a cave watched the approach of 2 enormous shoes worn by a giant flamethrower. He said a trembling goodbye to his parents. The giant handed him a Hershey bar. Another kid in a nearby cave with his mother and grandmother hadn't eaten for 4 days, but they wouldn't let him slip out to scavenge for food out of terror of the approaching Americans. When they actually appeared and called from the mouth of the cave, the civilians finally went out expecting to be tortured and killed. The boy's mother begged him not to eat a can of food offered him by a Marine, but he was too hungry to listen. 45 years later, his voice still broke when he told the story. In June, Marines told another boy they'd found in a Japanese uniform he'd surely be killed unless he took it off immediately. He happened to be not the Okinawan they took him for, but a petite Japanese soldier. Gullibility aside, American bravery helped many Okinawans. While some soldiers and Marines used grenades to ignite the napalm they'd poured into caves, others, or sometimes the same men, risked their lives to get civilians out when they realized whom the inferno was burning. If a balance sheet between atrocities and generosities is ever drawn up, an outsider who never suffered the pressures of combat won't be fit to do it. But ignoring the shameful acts completely, as virtually every military account does, is too good to war and its phony legends. If Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal could never again see a U.S. Marine without experiencing a feeling of reverence, as he said after watching a film of the 1944 landing on Saipan, Okinawa fighters themselves knew better. It was no atrocity to steal natives' chickens, pigs, and cattle, even if that was prohibited. Men who'd been withdrawn from the line for a brief rest couldn't be expected not to grill some fresh meat instead of trying to swallow more sea rations. It also wasn't an atrocity to throw phosphorus grenades into occupied caves, although they were terrible weapons. The thing about a phosphorus grenade is that you can't get it off the skin, so it just keeps burning into a person, an American medical corpsman who treated many Okinawans would lament. Mostly I remember the women burning. To me, phosphorus weapons are dirtier than napalm and they should be banned. It's just too cruel a way for civilians to die. However, they weren't banned, and the Americans knew their own lives were at stake from enemy soldiers hiding in the caves together with civilians. The grenades would prompt some Okinawans, including honorable civic leaders who weren't anti-American, to charge that the poison gas used on some caves was in violation of the Geneva Convention. Well after the war, still haunted by the huge number of civilian deaths, they'd ask interested American visitors to investigate. They did, and discovered what had actually happened. American explosives unintentionally released poison gases that caused thousands of agonizing deaths in the confined cave spaces. The most lethal was an acrid yellow smoke from the petric acid used in Japanese munitions stored there. However, assault does qualify as an atrocity, and there was much of it, even if most fighting units had no knowledge of it whatever. Some fully believed their officers' warnings that anyone who touches an Okinawan woman will be shot on the spot, or needed no such threats. But other individuals and groups behaved differently, and American military chronicles ignore their crimes. On April 7th, 6th Division Marines entered the house of a village on the coast of the Motobu Peninsula. A mother and her 14-year-old daughter were hiding beneath the house, as most women, except for the very young and very old, hid from the invaders whenever possible. The Red Giants and Red Ogres, as the two perceived the loud, sunburned Americans, dragged them into a little yard and took turns. Shame and disgrace, together with the Americans' role as victors and occupiers, kept the reported cases to fewer than 10 by 1946, almost all accompanied by severe bodily harm. The vast majority of probably thousands of incidents in all were not in the South, where most Americans were too busy and exhausted to think much about women, but during and after the far easier Northern campaign, especially by troops landed for occupation and mop-up duty, while the bitter Southern fighting raged in May and June. The easiest prey, with the least opportunity to lodge a complaint, were evacuees from central and southern areas, such as the Sonans. The silence of almost all victims kept it another dirty secret of the campaign. Few revealing pregnancies occurred, stress and bad diet having rendered most Okinawan women temporarily infertile. Many who did become pregnant managed to abort before their husbands and fathers returned. A smaller number of newborn infants fathered by Americans were suffocated. Other episodes were more mistakes than atrocities. A medical corpsman spied movement in the darkness of a night he'd never forget. "Hey, there's bushes out there that weren't there before!" The squad threw dozens of hand grenades and heard a chorus of moaning until dawn, when they discovered that all the dead and dying were women, one very beautiful. One of her arms had been blown off, and both legs were dangling on small pieces of skin. She was still alive, somehow hanging on, but there was no hope for her. She was mercy killed. It was sometimes a short step from that confused picture to the grimmer one of random killing. One infantryman would remember pumping bullets into straw houses on the northern edge of otherwise levelled Naha. There was some return fire from a few of the houses, but the others were probably occupied by civilians, and we didn't care. It was a terrible thing not to distinguish between the enemy and women and children. Americans always had great compassion, especially for children. Now we fired indiscriminately. On the other side of Naha, an infantryman bet a mortar man he couldn't put a round down the chimney of a little house about 500 yards ahead. We bet a dime, and I gave him 3 tries. His second round went straight down that chimney and exploded, wonk. We didn't know if anybody was inside, and it didn't matter anymore, just didn't matter. Several medical corpsmen used their carbines to force a family into another little farmhouse before setting it alight, then fired round after round into its windows and doors while it burned to the ground. Another corpsman from the same unit didn't know whether the civilians had done anything to provoke the atrocity. But those men never needed provocation for their brutality. They were the worst kind of redneck, bullying everyone, always looking for trouble, and so tough that even our officers feared them. Those particular officers, civilian doctors before the war, weren't forceful military leaders. The horrified corpsman who witnessed the intentional burning was confident nothing so blatantly evil could have been done in combat units which had better discipline and much less need for excitement. Not everyone in those combat units who killed a civilian unnecessarily was sadistic. Most simply no longer cared. Eugene Sledge and others were infuriated by the death of an old woman in a hut who had used sign language to beg Sledge to shoot her because she had a large gangrenous wound in her abdomen. Sledge would do no such thing, but another Marine pulled his trigger. Even in the throes of battle, the others felt passionately that their job was to shoot Japanese, not old women. Japanese, shoot back! But far from everyone could still make that distinction. Days before the campaign's official end, many Okinawans were sheltering in caves about 3 miles above the island's southern tip, together with some of the remnants of the 32nd Infantry Regiment, a sister of Captain Kojo's 22nd. Native historians recorded testimony that on June 18th, 19, and perhaps 20, some 60 civilian men who'd been flushed from those caves were separated from the women and children and killed, at any rate, never seen again. The perpetrators' identification as Marines is suspect because terrified Okinawan civilians didn't distinguish between American servicemen of the various branches, and no independent confirmation of murders has been made, although that has been done, very recently, for other civilian accusations of brutality long disputed by the services. But even if the allegations about June 18th, 20 were fabricated or twisted, the record of willful atrocities against unarmed natives is large enough, even if small in proportion to the number of man-hours spent under battle pressures that easily could unhinge the bravest. And although they remained far fewer than those committed by Japanese, troubled observers recognized the pitfall. One self-described green replacement watched a veteran run the blade of a knife through a sweating Jap's throat he was interrogating. He didn't know why, but after I fought for a while myself, I realized there was no reason for that kind of crap. Well, there was a reason, but it can't be accepted, because the minute you do accept it, we become like Japanese or Nazis, and there are no winners, just all losers. Beyond that, a Marine infantryman's later reflection that war itself is an atrocity may one day be accepted as obvious. Meanwhile, the notion that civilian suffering was accidental needn't be swallowed, since the barest knowledge of war attested to its inevitability. Although American firepower wasn't intended to cause the greatest civilian pain, the commanders knew it would. 26. The military toll. General Buckner had written General Ushijima on June 10th, 2 weeks after his evacuation from the Shuri line. Dropped by air, the message took 7 days to reach the 32nd Army's transferred headquarters in the cave high on the cliff above the Pacific. Buckner's invitation to end the useless bloodshed, useless, of course, in American eyes, is said to have prompted laughter from Ushijima and Cho, who found the notion of surrender hilarious. But both officers knew matter of days was no figure of speech. Cho busied himself writing cables to bolster the mainland's defense with lessons learned about the latest American tactics and methods, then tried to arrange for staff officers able to teach those lessons to smuggle themselves back to Tokyo. Ushijima's more ceremonial final duties included a farewell cable to his direct superior on Formosa, the commander of the 10th Army area, not to be confused with the American 10th Army opposing him on Okinawa. He reported that the overwhelming tide of the enemy's material strength, which won control of the land, sea and sky, had brought the battle to the brink of total disaster. The commander also confessed that his lack of wisdom and virtue was responsible for the failure, despite superhuman efforts from every soldier and devoted cooperation from the natives. Ushijima also promised that those facing the final mortal combat were fully determined to join the heroic spirits of tens of thousands already fallen on Okinawa. We shall, all of us, transform ourselves either into demons to protect the nation and destroy the enemy who is attempting to invade our mainland, or into a divine wind to ride the skies and join the battle for ultimate victory. Finally, the general expressed profound gratitude to higher authorities and other units for their cooperation and guidance, of which he'd had so little. Although high-ranking samurai's tradition of leaving behind a poem or two was not always observed in the pressure of the various national crises, Ushijima took the time to compose 2 jisei. The day after Ushijima's and Cho's reportedly laughing dismissal of General Buckner's surrender proposal, he visited forward positions for a first-hand look at the progress of his forces. Kamikazes were still crashing into ships, although the floating chrysanthemum operations had been considerably reduced in order to conserve planes and pilots for the mainland campaign, and American casualties remained severe in the faster but still deadly advance on land, almost 3,000 that very week, to be followed by even more the following one. June casualties alone, when the battle was supposedly over except for the mopping up, would be a third of Iwajima's heavy total. Weaker than ever with skin and stomach problems, nervous strain and cumulative exhaustion, sweaty infantrymen knew each terrifying day might be their last. But after 78 of them, 48 more than the number originally estimated for the job, the end was in sight, especially to the commanders. Buckner had just told another press conference that most of what remained to do was mopping up. At last, his optimism was justified. That afternoon of June 18th, he chose to observe a component of the 2nd Marine Division that had been withdrawn for 7 weeks to Saipan after making its fainted landing on L-Day. Its fresh 8th Regiment, recently returned to Okinawa, was spearheading one thrust of the final push, a kind of coup de grace for the spent defenders. But isolated Japanese artillery units in that area were still unloosing sporadic fire. Fit, tough Buckner had ignored urgings to postpone a visit so close to the fighting. Accompanied by the newly committed regiment's commander, he came up to a forward observation post easily in sight of the major ridge where Tadashi Kojo's men were about to spend their final hours as an organized force, then the cliffs at the island's southwestern tip. The observation post, like most, was a few square yards cleared of scrub, this one on Maisato Ridge. Artillery spotter glasses, supplemented by a second pair captured from the Japanese, had been positioned between 2 large boulders, roughly a yard apart, protection against the remains of the Japanese 1st Heavy Field Artillery Regiment on the next hill farther south, which had taken typical punishment on its retreat to there. In previous positions, that battery had sent puffs of smoke from empty caves in order to deceive American naval and artillery gunners. Still, day after day of concentrated fire terrified the men and destroyed their guns, the pride of the 32nd Army, some before they had fired a round. Now only one of a dozen was left. Miraculously spared, as one of its crew saw it, and maintained by parts salvaged from the wreckage of the other 11. Just after 1 p.m., one of the skeletal survivors scanned the hill to the north and focused his binoculars on the surprising sight of some apparently high-ranking enemy officers, who, using their binoculars, seemed to be looking in the direction of General Ushijima's headquarters on the opposite coast. After almost an hour at the vantage point, confident, hard-working General Buckner told the others that he was ready to move on to observe another unit. Before he'd completed his goodbyes, an expert Japanese artillerist ordered the remaining gun to fire at the tempting target of American brass. Spare members of the battery, knowing very well we'd get a return gift of 1,000 shots back from them for every shot from us, hurried into their cave. Since heavy artillery usually required considerable adjustment on a target, American officers were surprised by the accuracy of the gun's 5 rounds. One hit one of the protective boulders, flinging a shower of metal fragments and splinters of coral or rock into Buckner's chest. The odds favoured the commander's recovery. American battlefield medicine was as good as anything in the campaign, distinctly better than the general's intelligence and strategy. Thousands hit just as badly had already been saved. 7 hours of fierce fire kept Paul Dunphy, the first lieutenant who'd scouted south of the Asakawa for the major assault of the Shuri line, from being evacuated after the bullet or bullets had severed his bowel and driven fragments of his belt buckle into his intestines. He was spared when doctors on a hospital ship used a new technique, later described in a book titled Miracles of Surgery, to fuse his bowel. After his long hospital recuperation, a doctor, necessarily ignorant of the operation's long-term effects, told Dunphy's wife to take him home and have a good time because he had maybe 5 years to live. Dunphy would be in vigorous shape 40 years later. Young Forrest Townsend, a self-described country green kid, was hit by a Nambu light machine gun as he dashed across a field outside Naha. He lost consciousness in his rain-filled shell hole, but briefly came to in a battalion aid station, then in what he took for a field hospital tent, where he was given only a wet rag to suck for his desperate thirst. When he awoke a third time on a hospital ship, he had great trouble breathing. His surgeon came from near Philadelphia's main line, not Townsend's territory. The 18-year-old would remember that S.E. Avier's hands the rest of his life. They were the most gentle I ever knew, with real healing power, honest. He would tell Townsend that with his kind of hit, I'd say you were 1 in 90,000 to live. His heart must have moved a fraction of an inch when the bullet struck. Miraculous. But of course Townsend's recovery was more the result of surgical skill and the general quality of care than any miracle. Much would later be made of how earlier island fighting served to heighten the ferocity and deadliness on Okinawa. Analysts attributed the enormous mutual cost to both sides' application of lessons learned along the way. That was only partly true, since combat required as much improvisation on Okinawa as elsewhere. In medicine, however, lessons had indeed been learned and great progress made in life-saving techniques. Special landing craft equipped for surgery delivered the wounded to hospital ships. New penicillin and sulfur powder worked wonders, as did the sterling collection of specialists in burn treatment, internal medicine, and every branch of surgery. Refrigerated whole blood, much better than plasma for reviving bodies in grave shock from the loss of most of their own blood, had first become available on Iwo Jima 2 months earlier. Over 15,000 gallons were flown from the States to Okinawa in a matter of days. The new techniques helped reduce the mortality rate of the wounded to half that of previous Pacific battles, approaching Europe's rate. The exceptions came when dire cases couldn't be delivered to doctors in time, a terrible moment for their friends. John Townsend delivered a Marine badly wounded by machine gun fire to a battalion aid station and was told to place him with 12 others under a tree. Townsend, who'd never heard of triage, protested mildly. "Sir, if you leave him there, he'll be dead in 30 minutes. A doctor explained that since there was no hope whatever of saving him, he had to work on others. Like young Townsend, many infantrymen 5 minutes from the strain of battle took that explanation badly, especially when the wounded men were buddies. A few exploded and threatened to shoot the doctors. But such episodes were rare, partly because the majority of cases met the opposite response from medical personnel. Some wounded were frighteningly disfigured. Okinawa produced World War II's first American basket case, a master sergeant shorn of all 4 limbs. The sergeant was walking ahead of his men to spot mines when he stepped on one, but even he survived because he was quickly carried to a hospital. Still slightly deaf and suffering from shock when he was returned to the States a month later, he thought he'd make an excellent propaganda photo to end all wars. Unless the wounds were nearly fatal to begin with, or enemy fire prevented corpsmen or fire team buddies from starting the usual speedy delivery to emergency treatment, hit men had an excellent chance to live. The sequence of care began right on the line, where medical corpsmen, 1 in each platoon, applied first aid. They carried bandages and gauze, packets of infection-inhibiting sulfur, vials of morphine in self-contained hypodermic needles, and little bottles of blood plasma and brandy. The next step was the battalion aid station, often only 200 or 300 yards back from the front, but beyond small arms range. It was sometimes a tent with better supplied corpsmen or occasionally doctors who patched minor wounds, after which many men went straight back to their units. But aid stations overflowed during intense fighting and shelling. A short film of the youthful chests rent with deep gashes, limbs torn off, intestines spilling out, eyes wide with agony, and teeth gritted to stop moans would have educated the home front about the campaign's real nature. In any case, quick delivery to an aid station was crucial. If that could be done for General Buckner, his chances were good. In a month or more, he might even be able to assume the still larger command for the mainland's invasion that would surely be his if recovery went well. The seriously wounded were next delivered to a better facility. They were carried or transported to their division's collecting and clearing company, and from there to a field or portable surgical hospital, or to a splendidly equipped white ship with a comforting name such as Hope, Relief, or Solace. Many were still in shock, bodies slumped and faces twisted with battle tension, but conscious patients saw the floating hospitals as vessels of great beauty. Their hundreds of beds were full throughout the hardest days on the Shuri line, when other wounded were airlifted to base hospitals in Hawaii or the States. A veritable bridge of planes also transported hundreds of patients to Guam. The outward journey of Emil Ruchinsky was as typical as any. When the gunnery sergeant's platoon dug in for a long night of heavy mortar fire at the Shuri line, he was its new leader, the lieutenant having been hit in the morning and the platoon sergeant in the afternoon. As that third platoon leader in 15 hours crawled toward his company commander for instructions after many members were hit, he too fell. Ruchinsky felt as if a baseball bat had whacked him to the ground, but remembered his training and remained calm, calling for a corpsman. A sniper's bullet had entered the left side of his chest, shattered a rib, ripped his diaphragm, and badly mangled his kidneys and lungs. After a courseman's doses of plasma and morphine, stretcher-bearers brought him back to his battalion aid station, from where a jeep took serious casualties to a landing craft. They were hoisted onto a converted transport ship that had fought off kamikaze attacks while waiting offshore. Treating Ruchinsky at sea, the ship's medical services delivered him, after stops at Guam and Honolulu, to a medical receiving station in San Francisco. Later he was sent to a hospital in Virginia, the nearest suitable facility to his Massachusetts home, until his discharge in January 1946, 7 months after his wounding. By the end of the campaign, almost 31,000 men, 80% of all battle casualties, would be evacuated similarly, half by ship, half by air. Decades later, a man who'd seen the prostrate, blood-soaked Ruchinsky when he seemingly hadn't the slightest chance to live turned white when a grinning apparition who looked uncannily like him walked into a Marine reunion. The observer had to be convinced it was indeed the dead man, alive and well. When Joseph Bangert was rushed in to replace a just-killed corpsman on Sugarloaf, his platoon had to shout the dangerous "Corpsman" instead of Bangert, because no one knew his name. Bangert also knew no names and had trouble learning any during his baptism under fire, because his platoon kept getting replacements for guys shot bad, guys shot worse, guys killed, There were bodies everywhere, including one with half a head, although the man was still alive. Some tried to joke about getting their lucky ticket home. A much smaller number asked to be shot. "Don't let me go out like this, Mac. Put me out of my misery." But even some of those cases survived, to their own surprise. Field hospitals were clusters of tents serving as a combined evacuation centre and early-day MASH. Hospital apprentice first-class Edmund Schimberg, a 19-year-old from the Bronx, serving as a dog's body in Corps Evacuation Hospital No. 2, had arrived on Okinawa somewhat sceptical. Before we started functioning as a hospital, we were a running joke for ourselves. This screw-up outfit will never be worth a dime. But everything came together when it had to. The facility's neurosurgeon and urologist were world-class. The surgical group as a whole was excellent by every current standard, and expense was simply never considered. Schimberg stopped swabbing floors and changing dressings to assist with surgery when it was performed throughout the night. Trauma teams working under extreme urgency gave the tents the look of a city hospital's emergency ward after a natural disaster. If men were brought back to us alive, their chances were very good because the medical practice was superb. In the end, 97 of every 100 wounded Americans would live, including even First Lieutenant Dale Baer, the replacement for Captain Owen Stebbins, who was seriously hit 3 times during the first assault on Sugarloaf. That figure more than reversed the Japanese one of 9 in 10 dying. But General Buckner was about to join the 3%. Bleeding heavily, he couldn't be evacuated to an aid station. Despite the desperate efforts of a medical corpsman in his entourage, he died within minutes. The footsloggers who'd known all along that nearness to the campaign's end was no protection from death took his as confirmation. When the news reached the 32nd Army Headquarters cave by radio from Tokyo, Cho and the young staff apparently cheered. Only Ushijima, reportedly perplexed by their glee, remained silent and later supposedly said a prayer for his opposite number, although that may be rumour spun into myth. What is certain is that Buckner was the highest-ranking American killed in action during World War II. With so much death everywhere, his seemed to some not inappropriate. None of the officers standing feet or inches from him had been scratched. Like so many of his men, the commander had been dealt a dose of combat's vast store of random bad luck. Buckner's death occurred within hours of Ushijima's apology for failing to accomplish his mission. The reply of the Japanese headquarters on Formosa came the following day. A letter of commendation extolling the 32nd Army's great efforts and extraordinarily brave fighting. Ushijima issued a general order to his army that same June 19th, its typically vague phrases essentially calling on all to sacrifice themselves. The cliff containing Ushijima's cave, Hill 89 to the Americans, stood about 400 yards south of the village of Mabuni. That was just over a mile south of the last Yozadake-Yeiju-dake Kunishi Ridge mountain line and 2 miles from the island's southern tip. By the next day, June 20th, the hill and village, to which headquarters guards were sent as final combat troops, controlled only a small pocket into which much of the entire remains of the 32nd Army had been squeezed. Stretching some 5 miles along the Pacific coast, it was only a few hundred yards deep along most of that distance. Now the American Army's 7th Infantry Division attacked it from the north. First to encounter the outer edges of the first massive Japanese line south of Elday's landing beaches, the 7th, with rest periods, had been fighting since then. Now, a month after its hardest work at the Shuri line, so little was left of Japanese territory that army commanders hesitated to call for the usual massive concentrations of air and naval gunfire support for fear of hitting their own men. The weary soldiers had to eliminate the last resistance with flame, explosives, and tanks, breaking up the pocket into smaller ones and eliminating them one by one, like, a historian would write, a man stamping out so many snakes until there were no more Japanese to kill. On that June 20th, a brave soldier delivered Ushijima his last message from 24th Division headquarters, which was still holding out about a mile northwest. Meanwhile, units of the same 7th Division fought their way up Hill 89, a coral formation that rose over 200 feet, almost straight from the sea. Its jagged pinnacle was studded with crags and crevices, perfect protection for Japanese snipers, mortarmen, and a few machine gun squads with operable guns. Desperation stiffened their resistance. Flame-throwing tanks used nearly 5,000 gallons of napalm to burn them out. When the summit was finally taken on June 21st, only the area around Ushijima's headquarters remained. The large cave had two entrances, one facing land and the other the sea, both slightly below the fairly level summit. A Japanese prisoner of the 7th Division agreed to deliver a last surrender appeal to Ushijima. When he approached the landward mouth calling out the American message, it was sealed by an explosion from inside. A subsequent explosion, set off by Americans who found an air shaft, killed 10 officers and men, the first major casualties among the 32nd Army staff, who had been drafting orders while an average of over 2,500 people were being killed on the island during each of the 82 days since April 1st. Ushijima received a farewell message that day from the Minister of the Army and the Chief of the General Staff. He sent a last report to Imperial General Headquarters and broke off radio communication. That evening, American grenades exploding overhead rumbled the cave during a farewell party for surviving members of the staffs of the Army and of the demolished field units. Ushijima wore his full-dress uniform, Cho a white kimono. They toasted their guests with sake while dining on miso soup, fish cakes, canned meats, rice, cabbage, potatoes, pineapple, and tea. The two generals also savoured the last of a bottle of black and white that Cho, his affection for Scotch intact, had brought with him from Shuri. Deeper inside the long, twisting cave, headquarters personnel sang Umi Yokaba, a solemn ancient poem about sacrifice for the emperor. At 3 o'clock, just before moonrise, most of the officers left with most of the remaining men for a final die-in-honour attack. A more realistic assessment of the American strength all around them had forced abandonment of a plan for the generals to die at the summit, while watching those last units push the enemy off and down the hill, then retake Mabuni village below. An hour later, just after 4 o'clock, all was ready for a shorter sortie by the two generals. "Well, Commanding General Ushijima," the junior said, "as the way may be dark, I, Cho, will lead the way." "Please do so," came the still professionally serene answer. "I'll take my fan since it's getting warm." The generals rose, Ushijima picking up an Okinawan fan. Colonel Yahara was notably absent, the chief operations officer's request to join his commanders in their final act having been denied. Instead, Ushijima and Cho ordered the sober strategist to escape and make his way back to the mainland to inform Imperial General Headquarters about American tactics and techniques. "If you die, no one will be left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Bear the temporary shame, but endure it. This is an order from your military commander." Soon captured by American forces, Yahara would face severe criticism for failing to die honourably, despite his orders. Reversing his lifelong romanticism, Yahara's old antagonist Cho was particularly eager for young staff officers not to deprive Japan of the benefit of their experience and potential as leaders of guerrilla warfare on Okinawa by killing themselves. Although some staff officers nevertheless remained with the commanders now, 24 or so had already obeyed Cho by sneaking from the cave. While attempts were made to distract the Americans above, the two generals left the cave's unsealed mouth. Ushijima imperturbably fanned himself as they walked a few yards to a small ledge overlooking the Pacific Ocean. "These are calm minds facing death," a witness would report. "The generals have the air of immortals passing by." A sister-in-law of an Okinawan major, one of the few native officers of higher rank, had prepared the required white sheets. One was placed over a quilt on the ledge. Ignoring American grenades lobbed in the small party's direction, Ushijima and Cho bowed toward the eastern sky. Then, as James and William Belote complete the story, both knelt on the sheet, facing the ocean since room was lacking on the ledge to perform the ceremony facing north toward the imperial palace. That, at least, is more or less how most chronicles record the deaths, perhaps owing something to imagination. The traditional account, passed from writer to writer, relies heavily on the testimony of a Japanese military policeman who later admitted he wasn't where he claimed to be but heard the story from others. The cook who prepared the bountiful final meal supposedly watched from the cave mouth, where he was reported as having heard pistol shots, possibly the source of the blood at the temples seen in photographs of the corpses taken several days later. Shooting would have violated the samurai code, the notion of which enraged some Japanese officers after the war. You've demeaned their families and insulted the samurai way," one would scream to an Okinawan whose research led him to question the conventional version of the deaths. Some who uphold that version insist the death photos proved nothing because Americans had faked them. After all, a multitude of high-ranking Japanese officers elsewhere committed seppuku exactly as described on Hill 89. And the shots may have been fired by 7 staff officers, some accounts say 9, who blew their brains out at the same time. Still, some knowledgeable students of the campaign suspect that Ushijima's serene end may have been prettified to bring honor to his death and the samurai code. Definitive answers will probably never be found. Too many of the extant accounts derive from tainted sources, and too many offer contradictory details, even about what the principals were wearing. Some put Cho also in full-dress uniform rather than the white kimono. They differ on whether moonlight was shimmering over the sea during the farewell meal, or whether the moon hadn't yet risen, perhaps because even the date is uncertain. Americans believe the deaths took place in the early morning of June 22nd, but some Japanese place them on June 23rd. It is known for certain that soldiers of the American 7th Division found the corpses several days later, where orderlies had buried them, but was that in shallow graves below the ledge or in the headquarters cave? This too is disputed. Yahara had planned for burial at sea because the cave floor's coral was too hard for digging graves. Cho had written his own epitaph on a silk mattress cover. The founding member of the Cherry Blossom Society declared that he was departing without regret, shame, or obligations. The war, launched with much aid by his savagely nationalist society, had taken more than 16 million lives and brutalized hundreds of millions more, with a prospect of embracing a huge increase during the coming invasion of the Japanese mainland. The patriot was satisfied his honor was intact. At General Buckner's solemn funeral in an army cemetery, his 3-star personal flag flew alongside the stars and stripes. Riflemen fired a volley, and a commemorative artillery barrage shook the ground. Although Ushijima was given no such honors, Japanese prisoners were permitted, soon after the battle's end, to spend a few moments paying respects at his and Cho's graves. A year later, the commander was posthumously promoted to General of the Army, the second and last in Japanese history. The first was the revered soldier-statesman of the Meiji era, to whom he'd often been compared, Saigo the Great of Kagoshima. In the only Pacific campaign to take the lives of both sides' commanding officers, close subordinates kept falling. The day after Buckner's death, a sniper killed a Marine colonel who'd warned the commander not to come to the front. That same June 19th, Brigadier General Claudius Easley, assistant commander of the Army's 96th Division, was pointing toward a Japanese machine gun when 2 of its bullets hit him in the forehead. For once, the losses at the top reflected those at the bottom. Total 10th Army casualties would be 35% of the troops engaged, stunning by American standards. The 3,430 Marines killed represented 14% of all who died in World War II. Taking the island's 0.6% of total Japanese territory cost more than 1% of World War II's total American casualties. The full number would come to over 72,000, nearly as many as the 32nd Army's Japanese soldiers, excluding the Okinawan conscripts. Of those, 7,613 were killed and missing in action. and the remaining 64-odd thousand were almost equally divided between those wounded seriously enough to be out of action more than a week and non-battle casualties, chiefly victims of battle fatigue. Secondary sources often state that the 100,000 Japanese killed and captured indicated a highly favourable American loss ratio of 1 to 17. However, the overall impact, not including the Navy's unprecedented losses of nearly 5,000 killed and roughly the same number wounded, was less triumphant than those figures imply. Measured by the casualties they inflicted, Ushijima's forces performed brilliantly, but only at the cost of 10 times more KIAs of their own. The 10th Army estimated it killed 2,000 Japanese on June 19th, the day after Buckner's death, 3,000 on June 20th, and 4,000 on June 21st, figures hard to imagine except from death camps. The equivalent of half a combat division died during those 3 days, not including many of the Home Guard's last-minute, barely trained Okinawan teenagers. The number was also nearly half the total Japanese dead during the 36 hellish days on Iwo Jima. When the 5,600 men of the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade went to the bottom with Toyama Maru the previous June, the disaster seemed enormous. The ship's terrified soldier passengers could not have imagined that a greater percentage of them would survive than the proportion of the 32nd Army on land. 27. Expiration of the 32nd Army. The fall of Kunishi Ridge initiated an open season on the more than 10,000 diseased, partially armed Japanese burrowed in the trenches, ditches, and caves of the far south's flat sectors. Like the teeth of a comb, infantry platoons walking at arm's length across fields or scrubby rises cleared them out like animals, as a Marine would remember. They had no reason to know or care that many of the enemy soldiers who popped up from tiny holes had been there for days, often without food or water, or that they were terrified of their approaching death. If they'd been demoralized and desperate before, now many were frenzied, and what Americans did care about was that the cornered animals were still trying to kill them. We knew we were coming to the end, of course, but in a way that only made you more eager to live, to do anything to make it to the end after coming that far. Every day you hoped like hell it was the last one. 30 days was like 3 years.